What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on everything we know about Avowed following its gameplay showcase earlier this month, a few weeks ago, where we finally got our first look at some proper gameplay of the title. And since then, here and there, I've been parsing through some things, putting some things together, looking for details, that kind of stuff, so I could ultimately bring you this video. Because of everything showed at all those showcases, Avowed is the one I was personally the most excited about, as I'm a really big fan of Pillars of Eternity, a CRPG game series set in the world of Eora, which is the one that Avowed will be using. I enjoy that world so much, I actually did a lore series on it a while back, like a year or two ago, talking about some of the ins and outs and how things work. And as someone who is attached to that world, I had some questions answered, I still have some other questions, and we're going to discuss all of that in this video. But starting from the top, Avowed is going to be a first-person RPG set in the living lands of the world of Eora. We will be playing as an Imperial envoy sent to the living lands to investigate a plague that has been corrupting people's souls. We'll be doing this while in the company of several companions who will be closely tied to the story, and that's basically the general premise. However, it gets a lot more interesting when you start diving into the details. So let's start with our character. We will be playing as an Imperial envoy, like I said, but not just any empire, the Adir Empire, which I may or may not be butchering. This empire is a kingdom of humans and elves that make up the largest known nation in the land. However, just from here, I have a lot of questions about the timeline, because Pillars of Eternity 2 left the world on a bit of a cliffhanger in regards to people's souls. So when it comes to Avowed, what I haven't seen is information on said timeline. Is this before or after those events? Because I think a lot of that would feed into the story at play. But as this Imperial envoy, our race will be locked to either a human or an elf, which I believe is probably down to the fact that this empire is a human and elf empire. And while they could obviously right around that, I imagine another reason for that choice is simply making the things like animations and cutscene work easier, but that is just speculation. Now, when it comes to character progression, what we do have here is a few details. Nothing set in stone, but this comes from an interview that followed the gameplay reveal trailer where Carrie Patel, the game director, tells us that rather than picking a class or anything, we will be picking abilities through ability trees as we level up, on top of there being an equipment system. The equipment system seems a little smaller than what you might be used to, as it was described as fewer but meaningful upgrades. But in terms of our character and how we can build them out, it seems like that might be tied to the story in some way, because throughout both the trailers we are referred to as special in some way or having some amount of power that isn't typical, and this might be their way of sidestepping the traditional class system that was used in the Pillars of Eternity games. Because just in the gameplay trailer, we see this character using a lot of different kinds of magic. And as this envoy, it would appear we are a mage of some sort, or at least magically inclined, but the specifics of why we are able to do this and, again, sort of work around what is traditionally done in the Pillars of Eternity games seems to be tied to the story in some way, with the gameplay trailer asking us what we are going to do with all of that power. But the other half of the story is why we are there in the first place, of course, which, as I mentioned, is investigating this plague that has been devastating the land that seems to be interacting with people's souls in some way. If you're not immensely familiar with the world of Eora, a lot of it, in terms of its storytelling, revolves around animancy, which is basically the study of people's souls here. The cycle of life and death and what happens to an individual's soul in that process is central to the way this world works. And depending on if we are before or after the events of the second game, that could have a lot of implications. And seeing how in the trailer we can actually see footage of an animancy lab centered around an Audra pillar, which is a conduit for souls, it seems like that will play a central theme. In what way, though, remains to be seen, but I imagine this is being intentionally kept a little vague, and as we get closer to the game's release in 2024, which is what they have planned, we might get some more details here specifically. But let's talk about the world and exploring it a bit. Now, in terms of actually running around and exploring, it would seem that they have ditched the original open world concept concept. Again, in an interview, Obsidian's CEO compared the scope and style of the game to The Outer Worlds. The Outer Worlds used a sort of hub system where you'd travel from one sort of open world hub to the next, but the world itself was not seamless or anything. So it would seem to me that we're probably going to be moving through sections of a game world exactly like that, as opposed to, again, that more open world concept. The world itself that we'll be exploring is an area of Eora known as the Living Lands. The name pretty much sums it up, to be honest. It is a wild area of the world, teeming with unique environments, wildlife, plants, and it's an area that really isn't controlled by any one group so much as it is being colonized. Though again, exactly what that looks like depends on the specific timeline that we're looking at. But the Living Lands themselves are a sort of wild frontier in their depiction, and it's not something we've actually seen in any of the Pillars games directly, so they've certainly got some room to work with here. As we move through these worlds, we will be accompanied by companions, and these are apparently not optional. Whether or not they can die was specifically not revealed, but we'll have 2 companions with us at a time who are all very much so tied to the main story. And while that sounds a little bit odd at first, when I looked at Pillars of Eternity 2 in particular, it makes a little bit more sense actually, because Pillars of Eternity 2 is about the Deadfire Archipelago and the factions that want to control it. There's a lot of politics that go back and forth which represent each individual nation, and every nation is represented in your party via a specific companion. Depending on how you choose to approach those events, that companion may or may not leave you, but many of them are tied directly to the main story through the factions they represent and what those factions are doing in the Deadfire Archipelago. And I imagine if they take a similar approach to the companions here in Avowed, that would be pretty cool, while at the same time making a lot of sense. Now, we've only seen one of these companions in Avowed as it stands, and that is the Amawa we see in the gameplay trailer, who is narrating a bit of it, who we are told is named Kai. Each companion will have their own combat specialties in addition to us, of course, participating in combat, and while much of the gameplay trailer we saw and has surely been playing in the background of this video has shown you, it's going to be a mix of melee and magic. However, we also know that Pillars of Eternity is a world with guns, and some older style of weaponry like that will be available, though we don't really see any of those at play. Magic, I would say, seems to be the big focus here, with a lot of the animations for that being much more impactful than the rest of it, with Carrie Patel, as part of the interview, mentioning that they've put a lot of work into the feel of all of the weapons and how swinging an axe or a mace should feel different from a sword, etc. And for a first-person title, I think that's a bit more important, though generally with RPGs here that focus on characters and story, the combat and the weight of it, so to speak, does have a bit of leeway, as it isn't the only primary thing going on. Now, before we wrap this video up, I want to leave you with some of the questions I still had, the primary one being where this takes place on the Pillars of Eternity timeline, because that really will make a world of difference in terms of the story primarily. Because as I mentioned, Pillars of Eternity 2 ends on a potentially world-ending event, and if this story follows that, then I imagine the story of Avowed would simply be about one of the potential ways to solve that crisis. However, if it's a prequel, it might simply be a story about animancy and its role in the world as a science, as it's been known to cause a problem or two when you go messing around with people's souls. But other things I have questions about are how all the dialogue and choices are going to play out, and those are things that are very difficult to talk about as opposed to show. So I don't really expect to get an answer to that until I actually have something to play in my hands. But how the story plays out in terms of whether or not the gods of Eora are involved, and will the game focus on few but large choices or a variety of smaller choices with variable outcomes that then leads to greater sort of ripple effects out. Again, stuff that's kind of hard to quantify are the primary things I'm still curious about myself. But to sort of wrap this video up and summarize everything we've talked about here so far, Avowed certainly seems interesting. On one hand, I think what they've shown seems kind of promising, while at the same time making me cautious about how this could potentially shape up. Simply put, I just don't think we know enough about it yet, and given that the game isn't even releasing until next year, that's not a huge surprise necessarily. But I would say this showcase or this gameplay trailer and everything and the interviews all kind of seem aimed at redirecting people's expectations from the initial more open world Skyrim comparison that they had previously pitched the project as. Because now we know that we are going to be playing as a set character of sorts, not literally, but an Imperial envoy who can be either a human or an elf and will have a more focused experience to play through as opposed to a large open sandbox. And we'll be exploring a wild frontier beset by a plague of the soul, which is very typical for the setting. And the game itself will have a big emphasis on companions and its RPG elements. And while personally, I must admit, I really would have preferred Pillars of Eternity 3, I do think this game is sounding more and more like a Pillars of Eternity game than the genre shift might initially make it feel. That said though, that is pretty much everything we know about Avowed at the moment, and like I said, this is a game I am exceptionally excited for. If you want to learn more about the world this is set in, you can check out some of those old lore videos I made, but if you're just looking forward to more updates about this game, do subscribe and stick around. I'll definitely be covering them as we learn more information, but don't forget to like and comment while you're at it. That is, however, going to do it for me, so thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.